Introduce our speaker for the night.
During the 1800s, pioneers pushed back the frontiers of Western America. Today, in the West, the frontiers of medicine are being pushed back by Intermountain healthcare. For almost 100 years after pioneers settled the Intermountain West, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints operated hospitals from southern Idaho to St. George, Utah. In 1975, the church made a gift of its 15 hospitals. It was then that Intermountain Healthcare was created as a non-denominational, non-profit health system. The church charged the leadership of Intermountain to become a model health system, a pioneer, as it were, to show what healthcare could be.
We have long known that some places, like the Intermountain Healthcare in Utah, offer high-quality care at costs below average.
Intermountain operates 22 hospitals and more than 185 physician clinics. Our service area extends from southern Idaho to southern Utah. In addition to hospital operations, Intermountain has affiliated physicians and its own health plan, Select Health. The integrated nature of Intermountain contributes to its effectiveness as a model system. Intermountain is a learning organization. We're using that knowledge as we move into the future. One of Intermountain's approaches to improving care, improving population health, and using resources wisely is shared accountability. Shared accountability is the acknowledgement that everyone has a role to play in good health. Shared accountability involves patients, payers, and providers.
The secret to places like Intermountain Healthcare is that they are designing into care the best possible science. And they have shown that it's possible to improve care, and by improving care, reduce the overall cost of care.
Evidence-based medicine is a priority for us, producing higher quality at lower cost. At its birth, Intermountain was created as a nonprofit system. Resources generated from our efficient operation are reinvested in better health care for the communities we serve. Intermountain provides close to $250 million each year in charity care for those with limited financial resources. Every patient is given the best care we know how to give. We understand that people trust us at crucial times. Our mission-driven team is committed to using good science and continued innovation as we learn to be the best we can be for those we serve.
Are we on? Are we good? All right, so thank you everyone for coming here tonight. We have Dr. Charles Sorenson here with us this evening. Dr. Charles Sorenson serves as the President and CEO of Intermountain Healthcare. He also practices urologic surgery focused primarily on oncology. Dr. Sorenson earned his undergraduate degree from the Honors College at the University of Utah and later received his medical degree from Cornell University Medical College. Under his leadership, Intermountain has advanced its reputation as an industry leader in evidence-based medicine. In fact, Intermountain has been ranked the top integrated healthcare system in the country numerous times by Modern Healthcare magazine and has been cited as an example on how to do things right by leaders as politically diverse as President Barack Obama and former presidential candidate Mitt Romney. As you saw in the video, Intermountain owns hospitals, medical clinics, and health plans, and also owns or supports many community clinics that serve the uninsured and low-income populations in Utah. They provided $252 million in charity care in 2012 to those in need. While always remaining focused on patient care and providing health, Intermountain is also at the forefront of innovation, especially with regard to using data to achieve best outcomes. And they've recently opened a new innovations lab where they are working on many of the new advances you saw in the hologram display in the lobby. Intermountain is also one of the nation's leading research organizations. Together with universities and other organizations, researchers at Intermountain are involved in more than 1,300 studies to improve clinical care. On a personal note, Dr. Sorenson and his wife Sherry have 4 children, and in his spare time, to the delight of the 32,000 employees of Intermountain, he plays the keyboard for Intermountain's house band called the Galling Stones. So we are very delighted to have Dr. Charles Sorenson here with us tonight, and we all know we will enjoy his presentation. Thank you, Dr. Sorenson.
Well, it's truly a pleasure for Sherry and me to be here tonight. I feel like it's a little bit coming home to me. Although I never attended school here, my grandfather was a professor here at Utah State, and my dad attended Utah State University before leaving for the East Coast for a long time. But it's the memories of when I was a kid and coming out to my grandfather's office here are still strong, and it kind of feels like coming home. And I'm very honored to be here on the campus with you, and also to be here with great friends. Dean Anderson is a wonderful friend of many years. His wife Kathy is Sherry's closest friend, and Mike and Mary Glauser are also dear friends. So you're in wonderful hands with these folks. So I'm very happy and honored to be here to talk on your entrepreneurial series. And as you can see how we titled this talk, I really want to talk about innovation. I think that's what we have most in common with what you all are interested in being entrepreneurs, doing things in different ways. And heaven knows there's no area in greater need for innovation and doing things better than in healthcare. There's tremendous opportunity, but there's also tremendous need. And I'd like to focus tonight's discussion a bit on helping us together understand what the realities are in healthcare and what we're working on now at Intermountain, and where bright young people like you might be able to help as we innovate better ways to do things in the future. But with everything, I think it's nice to start with where we came from. It's important to understand just a little bit of the history and realize in a way how far we've come. And it's pretty amazing to me as I consider what I consider a fairly young life. I know you don't think that about me, but still, I mean, to see how medicine has changed over time is pretty remarkable. Now, I happen to know that Dean Anderson, one of his favorite shows is this, that he sits and watches. I think that Downton Abbey really made a great a way for a lot of middle-aged Americans to watch a soap opera and feel justified because it's on the BBC. and Downton Abbey is pretty interesting, and it gives us really a glimpse into all kinds of interesting sociology and stuff of what it was like back there in a different era, a different time. And some of the medical things are pretty interesting as well. In one episode that was in the 3rd season, one of Lord Grantham's daughters was very ill, and so with his money and prestige and all that, he's able to get one of the best, some of the best so-called best doctors of the day, and they're very worried about this daughter's health. And in this scene, which kind of stood out to me, as I heard about it from Doug, was, are you telling me that in this day and age, nothing can be done? As you see his daughter, close your ears if you haven't seen this episode yet, not have a great outcome from something that we would manage really routinely these days. And it kind of reminds you of how far we've come in healthcare in the United States, recognizing that in 1990, 90% of births occurred at home. And look at these statistics. Women lost an average of 3 children during their childbearing years, and 60 women out of 1,000 died in childbirth compared to 0.08 now. Profound differences. And, you know, it wasn't that long ago, this is 1950, when childbirth was looked forward to with great joy, but also a lot of anxiety. Because people died, women died in this, and leaving children without a mother and fathers without a wife. It's a profound change, but thanks to the work of a lot of people, that's changed, and that required a lot of innovation in how we do things over those years. But here's just a thought I wanted to share with you. You know, today, despite the many shortcomings of our health system, and we'll talk about some of the very profound shortcomings of our health system in the United States. The poorest among us today receive better health care than princes and presidents did 60 years ago. Thinking of Lord Grantham, I guess he wasn't really a prince. I don't know how the British system works. But I put the 60 years just thinking about 3 presidents. Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Dwight D. Eisenhower, and John F. Kennedy. That was about 60 years ago, a little longer for FDR, but I don't know if you know this. I mean, FDR obviously had the sequelae of polio, but he really died as a result of a number of strokes because he had uncontrollable hypertension. That wasn't that long ago. This is the President of the United States had uncontrollable hypertension that led to his death. John Kennedy almost died, as most of you know, if you've read anything about him, from Addison's disease, which is failure of the adrenal glands. And he was one of the first patients who got some experimental treatment using adrenal corticosteroids to treat adrenal insufficiency. He surely would have died. He nearly did at one point, and he suffered throughout his too short life with severe back problems that were the result of his adrenal problems and bone loss. And President Eisenhower had a heart attack, multiple heart attacks that would have been avoided probably if he'd been able to have modern management of cholesterol, and certainly maybe would have needed the kind of things that we can do as interventions now. These are the presidents of the United States. You know, despite our flaws, and there are plenty of them, and we'll talk about some of them, it's an interesting perspective to think about because that's just in my lifetime. Lifespans have dramatically increased. Childhood leukemia, this is even closer. This is when I'm in medical school here, that 9 out of 10 little kids who had leukemia died. It was a very bad prognosis. It's completely different now. Now the majority of these kids live, 8 out of 10 live long lives and go on from this to graduating from high school and beyond that. A profound change in a relatively short time. Thinking about what was personally for me, these are kind of my origins. This is my mom and my dad. So my dad was a physician and internist. While he was concluding his training in New York, it was World War II time. And he, along with a number of other physicians and nurses, and that's what my mom was doing at that time, were kept together, and they went off to the South Pacific to take care of sick and wounded soldiers on a little island off New Guinea called Biak, and then to New Guinea. So I grew up, and that's where my parents really got to know each other as they were serving together on these South Pacific islands. I grew up looking through the black and white photo album and hearing stories of treating the incredibly sick people in these kind of circumstances, and thinking it was pretty wonderful what my dad could do in his office and then at LDS Hospital in the 1950s and 1960s. Here's another journey. This is a dear friend of mine, Dr. Homer Warner, who died just a few months ago, but he was at the very cutting edge of computers in medicine in this picture. This is LDS Hospital in about 1960 when Dr. Warner was able to purchase, through a grant that he got, one of the first analog computers ever used in medicine, and used this analog computer to analyze cardiac waveforms, pressure waves, understanding better the physiology of the heart. This is a great story. I just have to, speaking of entrepreneur, this guy is unbelievable, the things that he did. Back then, nobody really knew what would happen if you put a catheter, you know, a small tube, up into your femoral artery, threaded up through the iliac arteries, up through the aorta, and into your heart. They'd done it on animals, but they were worried about cardiac excitability in adult people and thought you might trigger a fatal arrhythmia. So they didn't have the same kind of controls on research back then. But he couldn't really find anybody to do it on. So he had his colleagues do it on himself. And Dr. Warner had them stick in a catheter in his femoral artery, thread it up here into his heart, measuring the pressures continuously, and then ran up and down the stairs at LDS Hospital, get his heart rate up, and see how his cardiac pressure waveforms changed, and analyzed his own data on this. Do you like this? This is even more confused than the cables behind my computer. But it's an indicator of a remarkable person. So about 15 years later, this is Dr. Warner in 1972. I was working for him at that time. I was an undergraduate student as a computer programmer working in his lab up at LDS Hospital, where he really had the foundation of using now digital computers. This is a giant mainframe computer that was really impressive looking, but has less computational power than your phone in your pocket. But it was, he really set Intermountain Healthcare off on a track of using data in very powerful ways. Somebody who has made a tremendous difference as an innovator and thinking of things in a new way. Now we have out at our Intermountain Medical Center in the Salt Lake Valley, the Homer Warner Center, where we're using this data to really improve outcomes by really understanding what we do. And one of the points I'd like to make with you is data makes such a difference. We find over and over again in Intermountain Healthcare that when we accurately measure what we're really doing, we inevitably find that we're not nearly as good as we thought we were. And it's not easy to see that. And I don't care whether it's in an area of clinical outcomes or when it's in an area of business outcomes and compliance with complex regulations, all that. Whenever we look at the data objectively, or as our friend Jim Collins said in Good to Great, when you confront the brutal facts, you need to do that to change. Whenever we look at the data, we find room for improvement. And without the brutal facts that the data bring, we just can't get better. So our friend Homer made a profound difference for us. So what's now? Well, now in healthcare is a time of really healthcare crisis. And we've all heard, I don't know if it's true, probably somebody here speaks Chinese, but I've always been told that the characters in Chinese form crisis are composed of danger and opportunity. And that certainly is applicable in healthcare. This is a time of great danger in healthcare because there are profound challenges, but it's also a time of unparalleled opportunity for people like you to make a difference. The problems are problems of cost. I think you all understand that healthcare costs are rising at an unsustainable level. They're at unsustainable levels for government. They're at unsustainable levels for businesses that provide insurance to their employees. They're at unsustainable levels for individuals. Quality in American medicine, we hear a lot about the spectacular highs. Yeah, let me tell you, if you have heart disease or cancer, or if you're injured on the freeway, there is no place like the United States of America to receive the very best care. But that's what we call rescue care. We're not so good at maintenance and prevention, like managing high blood pressure or having the very best prenatal care for women. Those are areas that we don't do so well in. And then the third problem that people talk about is access, because as we know, if you don't have insurance, it's harder to get care. And then some people who live in rural communities, they're far away from a place where they can get good care. But really this access problem is principally related to the high costs of care. So these costs and quality are really the fundamental problems about which I'd like to talk a little tonight. So just talking about the cost problem, our current debt and the unfunded federal obligations are truly sobering. If you look at that, if you look at Social Security obligations, $7.7 trillion. The total national debt, about 16.6. But look at this. This is Medicare unfunded future obligations. The federal government has made promises to take care of all of us when we get old. Some of us are almost there, and some of you are far from it. But look at this unfunded obligation that they kind of say, we'll figure out later how to pay for that. there's just not more money to be found to take care of that if we continue on our current course. This is a great thing if you want to be encouraged or something someday. Log on to usdebtclock.org. And when you do it on your computer or on the internet, these numbers are continually changing. And not a surprise, they're not changing in the right direction. They're going badly. So here's the national debt up here at some 16 trillion. Here's the total personal debt of about 16 trillion. The personal debt per citizen at about 50,000. Those are sobering numbers. This is downloaded just earlier this week. Social Security liability unfunded about 16 trillion. Prescription drug benefits, Medicare liability. This is a different number that you saw from the other one because one of them is net present value, the other is current value. But the unfunded U.S. liabilities from the debt clock is this gigantic number, 123 trillion, which is, you know, here's the total national assets here. Less than that, you know, if you do the math, if you're a bank, the country doesn't work. The assets per citizen, if you know, all the assets of the company, of the country, all the assets would average out to about $300,000 per citizen. The liability per taxpayer, over $1 million. So someday you want to be a little sobered about the financial realities of, you know, here. You can take a look at that. But healthcare is a significant contributor to the risk, and it really represents a risk to business. It represents a risk to the future generations of Americans. It represents a risk to our national security, and we take that really seriously. So what contributes to the cost of rising health care? You can get simplistic and say, well, it's really because hospitals charge way too much for health care, and sometimes you go to the hospital and an aspirin costs $89.53. And there are some places that do their accounting like that, but there are deeper problems and more fundamental ones than that. I'd just like to talk about three. First is a huge problem with the way healthcare has rewarded those who provide healthcare in the United States forever. And that's called the fee-for-service system that rewards providers, physicians in the hospitals and the clinics, but principally the decision makers, physicians, based on how much they do. And the more you do, the more you get paid, and especially the more times you do expensive things like operate, then you get paid more. Or if you use expensive devices like an MRI scanner, you get paid more. And you don't get paid very well at all if you're just seeing somebody for a health maintenance visit, managing their blood pressure or their congestive heart failure, you're not doing something. So we've had incentives that reward volume, not value in the United States. We have an increasingly unhealthy population, and okay, I'm picking on Keith Richards again, who's British, but he had such a good picture, I knew you wanted to see him again. But it's really sobering when you think about what's happening to the health of Americans. We'll talk about that. And then this love of technology. I come here to throw this down to y'all as entrepreneurs as a challenge because so many of us think that the solution to these things is new technology. And I think a lot of it is, but one of the messages that I want to leave with you tonight is one of the ways to innovate in healthcare is having leaders who help us do things that we already know work and do that consistently so every patient, every time, gets proven best practices healthcare. And I'll tell you, in terms of innovation, I think that's the single most powerful thing we could do in healthcare, is to do what we already know works rather than chasing after some new technical innovation that's as yet unproven. And we've got some kind of fun slides and stories to tell you about that. So first, talking about incentives that reward volume. I couldn't help but select as my picture for this MRI scan of the lumbar spine, you know, and the whole thing. If you got back pain, well, gee, I guess I better get an MRI and see what's going on. You probably know that if you do MRI scans on healthy people who have no symptoms, you find a lot of people who have degenerative disc disease and even a disc that's pressing in on the spinal cord. But that doesn't mean they need surgery. But this is a very expensive test that pays people who do that really high. And the cost of medical imaging in the United States has been escalating in the last few years more rapidly than any other segment in healthcare because people think I need an MRI. There's a great book written in 2007. Actually, it won the New York Times Best Book Award in Economics, written by Shannon Brownlee. We had Ms. Brownlee come to speak to our Healthy Dialogue seminar in Salt Lake a couple of months ago. She wrote this book called Overtreated: Why Too Much Medicine is Making Us Sicker and Poorer. And it really it goes against what most people think. Most people think that if you get more health care and if you spend more money, you ought to get better outcomes. We kind of think that, well, if I spend more money on a car, I'll probably get a better car, on a house, on a computer. But in healthcare, that's not true. And she looks at the unnecessary health care that goes on in the United States. I shouldn't say health care. She looks at the unnecessary procedures and tests that really don't add any benefit to the patient. They only add cost and risk. And she says, when you think of the budget deficit in the United States, think of health care. When you think of unemployment, think of health care because of the high cost of insurance to an employer to cover her employees. And when you think of our children, when you recognize that our children's futures really depend on whether or not we can solve these complex problems, that puts it into perspective for me. So we have incentives that reward volumes rather than value, and the expectation is that more is better. So I couldn't help but showing you the cover of most doctors' least favorite medical journal, the Reader's Digest. And it just seems like whenever when I'm waiting to get my hair cut or something, I find Reader's Digest. And they always have a story, and this is a great example. Here's Dr. somebody, Travis Stork. I don't know him. I guess he's on a TV show, an emergency room physician, but I love this title. Patients Who Wouldn't Give Up and the Hero Doctors Who Saved Them. The theme is inevitably about somebody who has an obscure disease or a difficult disease and has had multiple tries to have something done until they finally went to somebody who worked hard enough and used enough treatments and diagnostics that found something. Does that happen? Absolutely. But we have an entirely unrealistic expectation in this country as a result of these kind of stories that everything can be solved if you have a smart enough doctor who's willing to spend enough money to get the answer and then fix it. Anything can be solved. It reminds me of a friend of mine from Scotland who said, I grew up in Scotland and then I lived for a while in Canada, and then I came to California. And he said, in Canada, they looked at death as just inevitable. In Scotland, they looked at death as a blessing. And in California, they look at death as optional. And that kind of mentality is kind of seeping into our culture. Well, the next area is increasingly unhealthy lifestyles. So here's a little advertisement for what was voted the best hamburger in 3 cities in the United States. I think it was Las Vegas and Atlanta and someplace else. It's kind of frightening to think about that. Recognizing these choices that we all make in our own lifestyles, including what we eat and whether or not we exercise, are just exploding with chronic illness in our population. Look at the growth in diabetics in the United States just over the past 5 years. It's truly alarming, with a 41% increase in diabetic healthcare costs, because it's not just the insulin and all the testing, it's the other things like the kidney failure that results in this having to be on dialysis, which, let me tell you, is not a great way to have to live. These are hard things that are very, very expensive. If we don't get a handle on this whole thing, on the choices we make, it's hard to imagine we'll ever be able to control our healthcare costs. And we will, for the first time in America, have a generation of citizens who's had a shorter life expectancy than their children did. Third area is this, I put sometimes, irrational love of technology. So we replace the stethoscope with the reticulated discombobulator. Does this really add value or not? There was this great article, if you're interested in this, it's really fun reading. It was in the Journal of the American Medical Association 5 years ago now by Finnick, Kane, and Leff, and it's called Gizmo Idolatry. And these authors defined a gizmo as a mechanical device or procedure for which the clinical benefit in a specific clinical context is not clearly established. But it's new, and it looks cool, and it seems good. And idolatry, then, is the general implicit conviction that a more technological approach is intrinsically better than one that is less technological and less, or perhaps even if there is strong evidence to the contrary. We are victims of gizmo idolatry in the United States in medicine in a big, big way. Notice it says, you know, if there's no evidence, then you kind of think that the high-tech way is probably better. But sometimes you even think it's better even if the evidence doesn't show it. I'll give you an example of that. So here's what the authors said. I just thought it was fun to share. Common sense appeal. It just makes sense that I was around when they started using lasers in surgery, and patients would say, hey, well, are you going to use the laser to operate on me, doctor? I said, no, not really. Well, why? I've heard that that's available now. Isn't that better? I said, well, I don't know. It just heats your tissues up and burns it. I mean, it's a good thing for some things, but not for general. But there were some people who said, advertising, I do my surgery with a laser. Sometimes it's great, like in the eye, but for things like I do, not. Human love of bells and whistles. I think we as surgeons are particularly like technology. That's fun. I love this, the way you put this one. Exploits versus uneventful diligence. It feels a lot better and more satisfying to the patient and the doctor if we can go do something, install some device in somebody, or do something, a diagnostic test, than to just say, you know, you've got congestive heart failure, and we really need to monitor your salt intake and your fluid intake and output and keep you on the medications. It's kind of just boring. It's better to put in a device. Proof of competence. Oh, my doctor is using the laser. My doctor recommended that I have the new joint implant. Proof against negligence. Doctors are worried about being sued, and if they said, hey, I use the latest technology, then they feel like, well, how can anybody criticize that? And then channeling money, which isn't talked about a lot, but there's a lot of this that goes on in American medicine, even by well-known academic medical centers who recognize that promoting new technology, even before it's been proven to be effective, is a great way to get patients to come there and receive their care. Let me give you a specific example in my own area. So my area is, as you heard, is surgery for urologic cancers. And prostate cancer is very common. And there are a number of different ways that you can treat prostate cancer. And it's important for you to understand that there is, of the ways that we'll talk about here, there is basically no evidence. If you know, when we all go to the national meetings on urologic oncology, nobody would say that there is one method of treating prostate cancer, localized prostate cancer, that has significantly better outcomes in terms of curing the cancer or in terms of reducing side effects or anything. But there are a number of different ways they're treating it. The first way, the way that's been around the longest, is surgical removal of the prostate. That's an operation called a radical prostatectomy, where you hire some dashing and daring and skilled people like these to go in and remove the prostate through an incision about that long in the lower abdomen. And that costs in our system around about $20,000. You can do a robotic prostatectomy, which is basically to do the same operation, but using this device that has these mechanical arms that can do it through, instead of one incision this big, through 4 or 5 incisions, each of which is about this long. Let's see, so if we add those up, it kind of adds up to about the same. And the surgeon sits over here at a console manipulating these robotic arms. And this just gained widespread adoption in the United States. More than half of radical prostatectomies done in the United States are now done using the robot, which adds significant cost with no benefit of outcomes. It fits all the definitions of a gizmo that we talked about before. It just seems like it should be better. Are you having the robot doing it? No, I'm having my surgeon, and his hand kind of shakes a little bit. I don't know. It just seems like it ought to be better. Brachytherapy is a thing where you put little pellets into the prostate through a little needle under ultrasound guidance that emit radiation. They contain an isotope of iodine or iridium or something. And then here's a CT scan with these implanted, and it gives a dose of radiation to the prostate. It worked quite well, maybe not quite as well as surgery, but it costs about the same. Radiation therapy using external beam radiotherapy has been around a long time. It's more expensive, though, than either robotic or surgical removal. Newer ways of doing radiation therapy, more expensive. But here is the king of all, the proton beam therapy. Now, instead of radiation treatments, this is a machine that instead of having high-energy photons, it emits high-energy protons, the nucleus of the hydrogen atom, that are directed into the tissue. And it's generated by a machine that's housed in a facility about the size of a football field that costs $250 million. And it's a great machine because of the physics of a proton, that you can very precisely locate where the beam goes, and there's very little damage to the tissue around it. And for some problems, like certain malignancies of the eye in kids, or certain spinal cord or brain tumors in kids, it's really the best thing. And about 3 of these machines in the United States would take care of all the patients in the United States who had one of these things. Well, when I last checked, there were 25 of these machines that are being constructed around the United States, used mostly with venture capital money. And the majority of the patients they're going to treat on this are patients with prostate cancer at a cost that's about 5 times what it is to take out prostate. Sounds good. Patients say, oh, thank heavens I was able to get to place X that has a proton beam accelerator. No data to show that it's better. But the patient's convinced that it is because it's the latest, greatest. So then that's tied with realistic expectations of outcomes. Do we really as a people understand what the options will lead to? Just think about CPR. And what does the American public think about our chances of living if we have a cardiac arrest and we call 911, or even if we're in the presence of people who are skilled in that? This was an interesting study done in the New England Journal of Medicine about a decade ago. And they looked on television shows like ER and Chicago Hope and Rescue 911. They found that 74% of people woke up, said, oh, thank you very much. My chest hurts a little bit, but now I'm fine. And about 3% had a compromised state, and about 23% of people died. How well do you think that corresponds with reality of a cardiac arrest? Not somebody who's been dead for a while, but somebody who has a witnessed cardiac arrest and with immediate treatment. Here's the reality. 3% of people have full recovery, 5% compromised. Most people don't survive that. That's the harsh reality. Now, we need to do research and do better on that, but still most people don't understand it. The really interesting thing is that the studies show, and I didn't bring the slides to show it for sake of time, but if we can inform our patients of what the outcomes are and what the options are, rather than just say as the doctor, here's what you need to have, instead say, well, for your knee, you could have a knee replacement, you could have arthroscopic surgery, or you can have physical therapy, and here's the risks and benefits of each, and here are the costs of each. Or in treating prostate cancer, if you give patients adequate information on which they can make an objective decision, we find 2 things about the patient's choices. One is that they much more frequently choose less invasive and consequently less expensive things. And it's not driven by their financial responsibilities, it's driven by their objective analysis of the cost benefit of it. And secondly, and this is really interesting, patients tend, if they're really informed, they tend to make the same decisions that physicians make when they're the patients. It's really a powerful thing, and it just shows us that we need to do so much better job in informing people. So now what's new? What's Intermountain's approach to these cost and quality programs? It's really, as was alluded in the introduction, it's implementing best practices. And that doesn't sound maybe very exciting or revolutionary. It's not inventing a new gizmo or a new drug, although those have their place. But there's so much opportunity in healthcare for us to get better outcomes at lower overall costs for the population by just doing the things that we already know work and doing that consistently, and we don't do that well in the United States of America. What we need is innovation in the management of healthcare, how we can really do that. So at Intermountain Healthcare, we recognize that, and in 1997, we started what we call our clinical programs in these 9 different areas of clinical endeavor. And we were kind of innovative there. For instance, historically, cardiac surgeons were part of the Department of Surgery in a hospital's medical staff, and they met on Tuesday morning. And the cardiologists were part of the Department of Medicine, and they got together on Thursday afternoon, and they never really taught to each other much. We said, that's crazy. We're going to have now one department of cardiovascular medicine and surgery starting at LDS Hospital, where weekly the cardiac surgeons, the cardiologists, the cardiac anesthesiologists, the intensive care people came together and looked at the processes that produced the outcomes for our patients and worked together on how they could improve those. So we've done that in all these different areas. And we go through this process improvement that you've all learned about in college and business school. We define the outcome measures that we want to understand. We want to say, we want to know what the mortality rate is a year after a cardiac event. We create a measurement system, and this is where the data systems that we've had at Intermountain since Dr. Warner's day have made such a profound difference, because we consistently find we're not as good as we thought we were. Then we measure our performance and we say, okay, we got to get better. We implement what are defined as best practices. Sometimes we figure these best practices out ourselves. Usually we've just gone out to the medical literature, the national specialty societies, and say the best practice for managing labor and delivery, or the best cardiac medicines to go home on, are these. Let's consistently do that for all our patients. We implement that best practice and we remeasure our performance, and it's this continuous quality improvement process. That's what we've been working on here at Intermountain for the past 18 years. So let me give you an example of this that I think is a pretty great one. It's from a while ago, but it was really interesting. So those of you who've had a baby or know someone who has, you probably know that the normal term is 40 weeks of gestation. And you may have heard that ideally you shouldn't induce labor electively before 39 weeks. And that has been a standard that was established by the American College of Obstetrics and Gynecology a long time ago, like 20 years ago. So in the late 90s, or maybe it was about 2000, our Women and Newborn clinical program thought, well, let's measure how we're doing at Intermountain and how many of our elective inductions are coming in before 39 weeks. Now, an elective induction, I should just stop for a minute if you don't know. It's so you're pregnant and you're 38 weeks or 37 weeks and you're thinking, I don't know any women who are 37 weeks pregnant and say, wow, this is great. I hope this goes on another 6 months. It's not easy. And there are other factors too. I mean, sometimes their mom can come at a certain time, and sometimes, frankly, the doctor says, well, you know, I was planning on being away for the long weekend, and so if we could have the baby on Tuesday, then you'll be home by the time I'm ready to go. Let's just bring you in and get this done. And that was popular for people. So we measured to see how we were doing on this national best practice standard, and we found, embarrassingly, that we had an embarrassingly high incidence of elective inductions before 39 weeks, nearly a third. So our women's and newborn clinical team, the doctors and nurses that ran that, went out and talked with the obstetricians. They said, wow, here's our data. Why is that? Number one, do you agree with the 39 weeks? And they said, yeah, it's good. Well, what about this? Well, after you've been in practice for a while, you can kind of tell when somebody's ready to deliver. You know, and 38 weeks is pretty much the same as 39, and even 37 if they look right. And we can tell. So leave us alone. We agree, but we think we're doing a good job. So we had this remarkable thing because we've been collecting all this data, thanks to Dr. Warner. And within about a week, we didn't have to do a prospective randomized control study or anything. We just looked at our own data. And here's what we found out, that if you induced elective labor at 37 weeks, then the little baby had a 1.12% chance of ending up in the newborn ICU on a ventilator. If you did it at 38 weeks, it was about 0.5%. And if you did it at 39 weeks, it was 0.21%. Now, those are small numbers, so you can see how an individual obstetrician wouldn't really know that in her own practice, because you know, these kind of numbers would represent just a handful of patients, a small handful in an entire year. But over a whole system, it's profound. So our people took that out to the doctors and said, well, here's our own experience. And this showed something that has been the basis of our quality improvement efforts at Intermountain. Doctors want to do the right thing. They do, and they want to be able to show that their outcomes are good for patients, and that was what happened. The incidence of elective inductions went way down and has remained near zero, elective inductions before 39 weeks. And the results that we found first off were that we had about a $1.7 million in annual savings by little kids that didn't end up in the newborn ICU. Now, these weren't dollars that came to Intermountain Healthcare. In fact, these were dollars that we didn't have to charge people for taking care of them in the newborn ICU. So I can remember very well walking into our board meeting in 2001 saying, here's the outcome of this. We had this reduction of little babies who were on a ventilator. And as a result, we didn't have to take care of them. And so Intermountain Healthcare's bottom line was reduced by about $2 million. And our board had a remarkable reaction. They said, that's great. That's exactly what we should be doing here. We're a not-for-profit health system. Go find some more things to get better outcomes at lower overall costs to the community. Because this didn't accrue to Intermountain Healthcare's benefit. This was a benefit to the community. I've told that story around the country, and it's just amazing how many times people come up to me afterward and they said, wow, if I told my board that, they'd fire me. And they say, well, go do something that results in better outcomes and more money. It's a profound lesson that it makes such a big difference in where you work, what you can do. The other thing that we didn't really anticipate then is by reducing these early inductions, we were able to reduce the C-section rate. Now Utah has the lowest C-section rate in the United States, largely driven by this. And you know, it's become the accepted practice in our. So what do we need next? We need innovation in healthcare that creates high value, not just some new gizmo. There's a few things to just talk about. We've got our little thing out there. It's called a hologram. Okay, I know you guys are high-tech people. It's not really a hologram, you know, but it's kind of a cool little display that shows some of the new things that are going on. Here in the near future, we think that, for instance, a young woman who's expecting, she'll be able to complete her entire registration online and have tours of the area. We're doing a lot of that now. She'll receive patient education online and on her portable devices. She'll be able to download trackers and smartphone apps. There's one right now called I'm blocked on it. It's Baby Steps or something like that. That has been a fun thing for new moms. And then this e-visits with our care team. I mean, we really need to move to the point where using your little computer and your camera in your computer, you can visit with people rather than come in. And really our goal is to get to the point where you can call or you can click or you can come in and make it more convenient for people to get the care they can get at home. So that's innovation. So as we conclude this, I think it's important to focus on what's at the center of all we do. I wanted to end with this because I think it's important for all you young people to think about this as you begin your careers. What's really going to be at the center of what you do? At Intermountain Healthcare, the center of all we do was expressed very well by Francis Peabody, who was a professor of medicine at the Harvard Medical School in the 1920s, and he died at a young age in about 1929. But I've had this plaque on my wall for many, many years. It's the secret of the care of the patient is in caring for the patient. And that's really at the center. And it means we have a responsibility in healthcare at these vulnerable times in people's lives to care about them, not just care for them, and to safeguard their health and their financial well-being too. I think it's just so important for each of you to find something that you can spend your days and put your hard efforts into something that has something, the meaning. For Intermountain, our mission is something that we talk about a lot. Our board has never lost sight of the mission from day one. And it starts at the top. It's excellence in the provision of healthcare services to the communities we serve with this vision that was said in the video to be a model health system. That was an audacious goal that was given to us by the founders who said, we want you, as this little collection of hospitals, to become a model of not-for-profit healthcare. And to do that through continually learning and changing and innovating, and to provide extraordinary care in all the dimensions. And we define the different dimensions of care, of extraordinary care, as clinical excellence, engaging our patients in their own health and wellness and making them feel cared about, operational effectiveness so we can charge the lowest possible rates in our communities, engaging our physicians in this collaborative effort, taking care of our community through charity care and through other things that we do, and having a great employee team. And those of you who are starting a business, don't ever underestimate the value of starting a business that is a great place for great people to work. It's one of the great gifts that you can give as a business leader. So I'll just finish on this one. If you have a chance, you can, I found Simon Sinek I was surfing for TED Talks once while I was sitting and waiting in an airport. And I found this one by this fellow, Simon Sinek, and you can see him on TED Talks, or you can do what I did and get the book. But he got with this book on Start With Why, and he said, in essence, you know, if you ask most people what they do, they can tell you what they do at work. Almost everybody can tell you what they do. And many people can tell you how they, together with their other colleagues, do what they do. And but the magic comes when somebody can tell you why they do what they do, and when the why is something that's profound and meaningful for the people who are so engaged. I think that's really worthwhile for you to ponder at your young ages and start off in your careers. And I'll just tell you that for us at Intermountain, the why is a noble cause that makes these hard jobs, and they're hard, they're stressful, they're complex, people work long, long hours, but the why is profound. This is a picture of our bone marrow transplant unit up at LDS Hospital. And they have this wall where patients started years ago. We were doing some construction a number of years ago, and patients just sort of started, can I write a message on the wall, my thought for the day? These are folks who are there for weeks. Some of them are very, very ill. And they found it was healing for them to be able to write their feelings on the wall. And then that led to something more permanent, a patient wall. And as you stand there in front of that wall at LDS Hospital and see these individuals, each one of whom represents a profound journey for that individual and the people who love her, it's a profound why. And we think about this every day at Intermountain Healthcare, that we're profoundly privileged to stand with our fellow beings at critical crossroads in their lives and help make their journey safer and more fulfilling. So for us at Intermountain, that's what propels us forward to try to innovate and find better ways to do that. And I hope that each of you will ponder in your own mind, you know, what's really going to be meaningful for me to spend my days at work, that there's a why that really means something. So thank you for your attention. If we have time, Mike, we could maybe take a few questions. Few questions, yeah. Kind of ran a little long, sorry about that. Yes?
So with the best practices and so forth, it's obvious that those changes really made IHP stand out, and it's been really good. You know, the evidence on that is clear. But sometimes you still get physicians who say that it's cookbook medicine and it kind of takes away their intellectual ability or whatever. So I'm just wondering how you're going about satisfying some of those complaints, because it's so obvious that that's what's
I'm really glad you asked the question. The question, if you didn't all hear it, was some pushback from physicians who say, oh, these best practices, that's really cookbook medicine, and it takes away the individuality, it takes away the art of medicine and all that. I'll be honest with you, I don't hear that complaint nearly as often as I heard it 15 or 20 years ago. It was pretty common then, and I rarely hear it now. And the analogy that I gave to my physician colleague friends back then when we started, I said, okay, I understand your concern, but look at the complexity of what we do. Do you really think that you alone by yourself can figure out the best way to do everything? And then I go on with the analogy. I said, so when you're getting on an airliner, do you feel pretty good when you have somebody who comes on the plane after everybody else is loaded on, they've got their silk scarf and their leather flying jacket on, and say, I don't need no tower or ground control or a checklist or any of that kind of stuff. I'm experienced and I know how to fly this plane. Well, I'm the first person to get off that plane. I want the person who understands that this is a complex process, that there are proven safety ways to get that plane off the ground, through the air, and land again. And that's the way healthcare is. And most doctors understand that. And like with the example I showed, I think if you're able to really show them the data that doing it by best practices yields better outcomes for their patients. And now more and more of them are concerned about the costs. Then they're sold. They say, yeah, I'm on board. Because and it's a good thing. We're going to be increasing, will be measured transparently in terms of our quality and cost outcomes. And we're telling our doctors together we want to be able to have the best outcomes any place. Yes?
Okay, this might be kind of a hard question to answer, but what, you being the CEO of Intermountain, what is your biggest concern with Obamacare?
Yeah. The President's Healthcare Reform Act, actually, a lot of us were pretty hopeful back in 2008 and 9 that, okay, we're going to take a look at this critical issue and we'll have objective review. It turned out it became very, very politicized, and as probably some of you know, the ultimate law that was passed was really never intended to be a law in that form. I mean, it was written in a draft form and it was passed by the Senate and then or by the House, excuse me, and then the Senate, because of the loss of Senator Ted Kennedy, they couldn't override they could override a filibuster, and they weren't able to pass the same law. So by a complex legislative mechanism, they basically put the draft bill that had been put together by the congressional staffers, made that the law. And so there's a lot of complexity in the law that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But it really focuses on what are called accountable care organizations. And really, the concept is good that we as providers ought to be held accountable for the quality and the cost outcomes for a population. The place that fell short for political reasons was that patients don't even need to know who they're signing up for. It's not like they say, well, I'd like to go to this group of doctors and I'll use them for my care, and this group of doctors can be held accountable for the care. They can kind of go any place, and yet this group of doctors is accountable for the cost and outcomes. That doesn't make a lot of sense. The other shortcoming, and this is much more profound, I just don't think we can get to where we need to be if the only people that are accountable for cost and quality outcomes are the providers and the payers. We as individuals need to have accountability for the lifestyle choices we make, how well we manage chronic illness, how well we prevent chronic illness. So at Intermountain, we've been talking for the last 3 years about shared accountability instead of just accountable care. Shared accountability to get all three of us involved. We as providers of healthcare, the doctors and hospitals, the payers, the insurance companies, and us each as individuals, helping us make better lifestyle choices that result in better health outcomes and lower costs. Yeah.
So I have a lot of friends that are doctors, and I hear a lot of them complain about their malpractice.
Yeah.
I know it's changed a lot. And I was talking to my brother about it, and he was kind of explaining that there's two sides. So one is just that malpractice is really high burden of the doctors, but the other is that they need to be held accountable for surgery they're performing or whatever. Has anybody ever maybe visited how that could be accomplished without being so expensive?
Yeah, that's a great question. And a lot of doctors say, and rightly so, that much of the stuff they do that doesn't really add value, adds cost in doing additional tests or things like that, is just to protect against the allegation that, oh, you overlooked something. Yeah. And there was a proposal in Utah about 20 years ago, a no-fault kind of a thing, where it really took it all out of the tort system and said, okay, if there's a bad outcome without assessing blame, let's get the dollars to the patients. And they figured out that based on the number of patients that were injured as a result of healthcare without assessing fault, that we're spending about the right amount of money. If we still spent the same amount of money on that, we would be able to get those dollars to the patients who had problems rather than having over 2/3 of it consumed by the litigation system. But it just never went anyplace because there are powerful lobbies that like it the way it is. So, my answer to that, and if you talk to the tort lawyers, they say, well, we'd have to go away. We'd have to get into a different line of work if you all would never make a mistake. But the problem is that, that there's no science behind it. It's how you tell it to the jury. The science isn't really driving it. But I really do think that the answer to this is, again, if we're consistently following evidence-based best practices, that ought to be a powerful defense. Say, yeah, I'm sorry the baby had a bad outcome, but look at the care. Delivery was done at the appropriate time, the appropriate prenatal medications and testing was done. Everything was managed right, but sometimes nature doesn't work the way we wish it did. It's not really anybody's fault. So I think, again, trying to do evidence-based best practices is a powerful defense there. Maybe take 2 more questions, then let go. Yes. Let's see. Let's start with you since you had one.
So speaking of best practice on a different line, as students, in your position, you oversee 30,000+ employees. What tips would you say as best practices to prepare for a career path trajectory that you would recommend looking at this stage in our lives?
Great question. Good question is, what's the career path if you want to get into healthcare leadership? And I just took one I didn't ever plan on, to be totally honest with you. I love being a doctor. That's what I wanted to be my whole life. But I got involved in the early 90s with Intermountain and looking at new ways we could organize together and really focus on clinical best practices, and was on the board and then was asked if I'd be willing to consider a leadership role. So I kind of took a different route to that. The more typical route would be through getting either an MBA or an MHA and then getting experience in healthcare management. But increasingly in medicine and healthcare, we need to have people who combine a clinical background, either in nursing or in medicine, with people who have an understanding of how business works. Because our answers to all these questions are not going to be a silver bullet, I don't think, or some device or gizmo that solves the quality and cost problem. But it's in leading an organization to focus on consistently doing the right thing and getting these complex teams to work together. Medicine is way too complex to be a single, a sport played by a single hero like the cover of the Reader's Digest, the hero doctors. It's a team sport, and it's the most profoundly complex team sport that I know about. And have leaders who understand the clinical side as well as the administrative side is really important. But we need leaders on both sides, not just the ones who share that. We probably ought to conclude, shouldn't we, Mike? And I'm happy to stay a little longer, but I don't want to keep you too late.